So, friends, good morning to you, and it's very nice to be addressing you today. The First of all, let me check with you. Are you all able to hear me clearly? Is my volume, everything is fine? You can hear me clearly?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
yeah. So one of the things I would say is that I will be speaking. I do not have any PowerPoint presentation. It's just a straight, uh, I'll be conveying my thoughts to you. And if at any stage you would want a clarification, you can just ask me the question. I will stop and I'll explain. And that could be one approach, or the other is I will go ahead and make the full presentation. And at the end of the presentation, you can ask some questions, make some observations, etc. But certainly at any stage, whenever I'm saying something, if you are not able to hear or understand, you just tell me so that I'll repeat it again. So you should be able to hear what I'm saying. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah, fine. So the area that I've been asked to speak on is the political economy of development. It will be a very broad overview of different ways of looking at development in the Indian context, of course. So this is what I have with me today. This is what we should try to look at. So, uh, so let's begin. So, my focus, of course, will be the Indian context, but while talking about the Indian context, certain other theoretical ideas may come in. We'll be talking about that as well. So, what I'll do is that we are starting about 8 or 9. So, I'll take my lecture for about 45 minutes to 1 hour, and after that, there'll be some time and we'll be able to discuss. Okay, so I'm looking at the Indian development scene, and what we have is the following. Well, some 73 years after the country's independence, the vast majority of our country continues to live in relative penury. Close to about a quarter of the Indian population still lives in absolute poverty. In terms of the Human Development Index 2020, computed by the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, India's rank is 131 in a listing of some 189 countries. India is home to some 4.7 crore stunted children, about a third of the world's total. In terms of the performance of the Indian economy in the very recent past, the story is anything but encouraging. It's a very depressing story, actually. Part of the immediate recent problem is due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has resulted in the sharp shrinkage of the GDP in the first quarter of 2021 of as much as minus 23.9%. We all know this. In the first quarter, the drop was as much as nearly 24%. In the second quarter, too, the economy shrank, and the shrinkage was as much as 7.5%. Now, over the entire year, we know that the economy shrank about 7.7%. GDP went down by about 7.7%. Quite unprecedented. But of course, it was because of the COVID and the lockdown that we went in for. But it is worth underlining that the Indian economy had been in the midst of a crisis even before the onset of COVID. The growth rate of GDP gradually fell from a figure of 8.26% in 2016-17 to 4.18% in 2019-2020. So the point is, even before COVID, the Indian economy uh, was going down in terms of its growth rate, no question about it. Just before the onset of the COVID, the growth rate had dropped to something like 4.2% or something like that. Remember, I mean, we have had in recent years growth rates touching about 9%. At the very beginning, 2005 to 2008, the growth rate for a 3-year period was 9% plus. And then 2008, the financial crisis came, the growth rate went down. But again, it came back up, and by about 2013, 14, 15, the growth rate again had come back to a level of something like 7.5 to 8 percentage point. And at that stage, the Indian growth rate was pretty good. And in fact, there were certain years in which we tipped the Chinese growth rate. So India was one of the fastest growing countries. But subsequent to that, as you know, in 2016, we went in for the demonetization, possibly leading to a sort of big hit on the growth rate, definitely to the tune of 1.5 to 2 percentage point. And then after that, the GST, which again brought in a lot of disturbance to the economic sort of production arrangement, etc. So all of these contributed to the growth rate being severely sort of affected, and it had gone down to about 4.2% just before the onset of COVID. But in addition to this, there have been problems regarding data measurement pertaining to the GDP. That is also another of the worrying features. The government held back a report on employment, which was showing a very high rate of unemployment, the highest in the last 45 years. And this was done somewhere around 3 years back. And that was a very major sort of difficulty regarding the management of the data system of the government. Now, it is possibly also the case that we need to be looking at some of the other features of the Indian economy, in particular, the issue of inequality in the Indian economy. And this is possibly one of the most disturbing aspects of the Indian economy. There has been an alarming rise in inequality in the Indian economy. India has the dubious distinction of being among the most unequal societies in the world today, barring a few countries like South Africa and so on. India has a highly unequal distribution of income as well as wealth. There's been a lot of work done on this. Thomas Piketty is one of the very well-known figures, French economist who has been writing on it. 2 major books he has on it. And among other things, we know that in India, the top 1% enjoys something like 22% of income of the country. And the top 1% enjoys 58% of the wealth of the country. Of course, wealth inequality is almost always much more unequal than income inequality, as we know this. And India has one of the most skewed distributions of wealth as well as income. Now, it is also interesting to see that even as India has a high presence in the World Hunger Index, we know that. But side by side with this, there are 5 Indians among the 100 richest billionaires in the world. Disturbingly, the net worth of Indian billionaires has surged a whopping 90% in the past decade. The top income earners seem to be doing very well. Most tellingly, even during the corona epidemic, even when the incomes shrank across the world and within India, of course, there was an extensive loss of jobs. There were migrants, more than 4 crores moving back into their hometowns and villages. Even when the poor were doing so badly, losing their jobs, down to no income at all, the top income earners seem to be doing very well. And as you possibly also know, everyone knows that the stock market in India is doing very well. I mean, this is happening at a time when the vast majority of the country is going through very severe, challenging times, but the stock market seems to be moving up. And how come? Well, the stock market is sort of managed and sort of engaged with by barely the top 2 or 3% of the population. They seem to be doing reasonably well, and the stock market is booming, whereas the rest of the country is in a very terrible situation. Now, as we are even talking about all these problems, the difficulties of the Indian economy, the farmers' problem continues. The farmers have been outside of Delhi now for more than 2.5 months. Their demands are simply for the government to do away with the 3 farm laws, which were completely sort of wrongly brought in, not discussed at an earlier point in time. The farmers were never really taken into confidence on it. And at bottom, what they are simply asking for is minimum support price for their farm produce. And the government is not agreeing to that. So the farmers' protest continues. So that is the situation we have right now. So all in all, we have a rather sort of worrying situation in terms of the broad features of the Indian economy. Nothing seems to be particularly engaging and encouraging. But despite this, there is a sort of political narrative that tries to argue and show that everything is going well and everything is fine with the country and so forth. Even where the entire farming community across the country, I think the support for the farm protest is not coming only from Punjab, Haryana, Western UP and Rajasthan. It is all across the country. I think there is a very broad-based support for this. But and farmers constitute more than 50% of the working population of this country. So we have a very strange situation where the government is completely unmindful of the sort of demands of this large section of the population, and seems to be sort of happy with the idea that everything seems to be all right. So this is the kind of situation we have right now, and we have to make some assessment of it. And in terms of the political economy, is this the right way to go? This is the question that I'm asking uh, today, this morning. Um, in addition to all of these difficulties, if you look at the industrial sector, some very um, severe laws have been brought in the industrial sector as well. The government has brought about major changes in labor laws governing the industrial sector that has unmistakably led in the direction of worsening the rights of labor. The Industrial Relations Code Bill 2020 restricts the right of workers to strike. There is an increase in the threshold relating to layoffs and retrenchment in industrial establishments, having some 300 workers from 100 or more workers at present. This will provide greater flexibility to employers for hiring and firing workers without legal consequences. More than 90% of Indian workers are engaged in precarious informal work. Several state governments have rolled back many of the existing labor laws that essentially protected the fundamental rights of labor. For example, Uttar Pradesh has taken the dramatic step of proposing an ordinance that seeks to exempt firms from most of the labor laws. So I think laborers are now completely without any kind of legal protection. And that is the manner in which the government seems to be sort of managing the economy. The farmers' rights completely sort of put on the side, not being given any importance. Industrial workers also, their basic legal rights, they're also not being observed. Now, what I now want to look at is in what ways, in what kind of manner are we to look at the situation we are in, and we have to consider if there are any alternative ways of thinking of the organization of the Indian economy. Now, there is a majoritarian view, as I was just saying just now. There's a majoritarian view that suggests that India has already arrived in the Committee of Nations, is part of the big league, so to speak. And that is very much the political narrative. Three factors may be adduced to think of this kind of view that India is already a sort of big player in the arena of the major countries of the world. Now, there are three reasons why one could be thinking in this manner. First, along with China, India is, of course, the only country with a billion-plus population. Okay, it's a population base, the demographics that gives India the sort of advantage and possibly the reason to believe that we are the big players. We are among the big players. Certainly that is true. The second is India's rich civilizational past. India has a very long civilizational past, of course, along with China, along with some of the other countries, Mesopotamia and so forth. That also gives the Indian sort of leaders to think of themselves as one of the major players. So big population, the demographics, the big civilizational past. But a third reason, which is the one that we are concerned with here in this particular lecture, the third has to do with the recent experience of the Indian economy to have shown pretty high rates of growth in certain segments of our development process in the very recent past. In that, what I'm trying to say is this. In the very first decade of this century, and during 2005 to 8, we hit the growth rate of 9 percentage point. And as I mentioned, the financial crisis negated that in the year 2008. There was a dip, but again, we came back up, and for a period of 3, 4, or 5 years, we were doing reasonably well. Now, this experience of high growth um, brought a kind of optimism to Indian minds that we can actually do quite well, and we can solve most of our major problems that have to do with poverty, inequality, and so forth, simply by the process of growth. Now, so this is the third major reason why India feels that we have really arrived in the Committee of Nations. Now, the point I now come to is the following. Even if, even if it is the case that there is a particular narrative that is being sort of played out, which shows that India has really arrived in the major, among the major countries of the world in this manner. If we really seriously look at the actual conditions of living of the sort of bottom 2/3 of the population, is there any reason for us to sort of be confident or be satisfied with the fact that we are among the best performers, which is the kind of narrative that is being built? And what I'm trying to suggest is that that is not the case. We have some very serious issues pertaining to our economy and polity, and we need to look at the problems in a very serious manner. So as I started with in the lecture, I looked at the issue of inequality. Now, inequality is a very major problem that affects not only the economy, but also the polity of the country. And also the sociological aspect is very severe on this. And the issue of inequality, of course, is not only an economic issue, it is a broader social and political issue as well. A lot of the inequality in the Indian economy emerges from the sort of sociological caste divisions that we have in the country. And this is part of a historical legacy. And so when we look at the issue of inequality, it is not only the economic inequality, but it's also the sociological. And we have to look at all of these issues in a combined kind of manner. In his last book, Piketty, the last book of Piketty is the book with the title Capital and Ideology. In his recent work, Piketty says that every human society must justify its inequalities, or the entire social or political construct could collapse. So Piketty's point in this sort of statement is simply this, that the inequality that exists in an economy like India is justified by the political and the social narrative. And this has to be questioned. This has to be questioned. And he suggests certain ways in which we should be looking at the issue of the manner in which the problem of inequality can be addressed. Now, uh, uh, while talking about the Indian case of inequality, Piketty observes that in the first 3 decades of India's planning regime, so we started the planning regime in the year 1950, and Piketty's observation is that in the first 3 decades of India's planning regime, starting in the early 1950s, the inequality index was kept within bounds. And his point was that, yeah, I'm seeing some questions as I go along. I'm going to be addressing all of these questions while we go along. So just keep it in your mind, and as I said, I'll be completing whatever I have to say by about 9 o'clock, and after that we'll have plenty of time to discuss the issues that you have in mind. So, uh, so Piketty's point was that during the planning regime, the inequality in India was kept uh, within bounds, and his basic point is that when you allow for the market mechanism to play out and the state activity to be constrained, and the state sort of constrains or reduces its hold on the economy, the inequality indicators increase. So in his analysis, he shows that the Indian inequality measure was within bounds during the planning regime, and it increased in a very sharp way after 1991, after the sort of liberalization and the economic activities were opened up to the private sector. Now, in terms of the indices, in the year 1980, in terms of his calculations, the top 1% of the rich Indians enjoyed about 6% of income. The richest 1% enjoyed 6% of income in the year 1980. But after the liberalization process was started in 1991 and the economy was opened up, over a 30-year period, inequality has increased in a very sharp way from the top 1% enjoying 6% of income. It now is at a situation where the top 1% enjoys 22% of income. This has been a very sharp increase in inequality, according to Piketty's calculations. This is very broadly agreed to by many of the other scholars working in the area of inequality. So, so there is a second major difficulty with inequality that we need to also be concerned with. Inequality has the effect of reducing the effective demand. Um, uh, the growth potential of a country is sustained in a situation where demand is allowed to be generated in a consistent manner year after year. But if inequality increases, then this leads to a situation of constrained demand, because when uh, large fractions of income goes to the top end of the population, effective demand goes down. Substantial writing and thinking on this, starting from the time of Malthus, Gillespie, and others, show that the more unequal an economy, the less effective demand such an economy has. Now, that leads to a situation where the growth potential ultimately is constrained. So this precisely is the point that Piketty is trying to make. So if you have an economy with more inequality, that will constrain demand, and that will ultimately sort of reduce the growth potential of an economy. Now, uh, the point that I'm trying to make is that the way to look at the economic development in India past post-independence from 1947 onwards, if we look at the period going up till, say, 1980 or thereabouts, when we had a strong planning regime, there were certain difficulties with the planning regime, no doubt about that. Growth was constrained. That was one of the big issues with the sort of development process during the planning regime. But there was a certain manner in which we can say that the distribution of income was more equitable during that particular period. Now, there is a choice one has to make about the 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 uh, choice between growth and equitable distribution. And we, from 1990 onwards, we have gone to a process whereby we have gone in for growth by uh, reducing the role of the government, expanding the market possibilities, but this has increased inequalities. Now, the question now is whether we should allow the inequalities to continue to increase in the manner it has, or whether we should think in terms of constraining the growth of inequality by putting certain kind of social measures that will reduce the growth of inequality, but at the same time enable the economy to grow at a reasonably um, sort of steady pace, so that uh, the economy grows at a reasonably steady pace, addresses the issues of poverty and education, health, and the very many other important factors, while at the same time inequality is kept under check. Now, how is that to be achieved? This is the issue. Now, what I would like to say is that in trying to look at some of the possible uh, uh, ways in trying to look at a solution to the Indian developmental problem, some of the answers are possibly to be sought in the thinking and the writings of um, a few major Indian thinkers and major political figures that we've had, and we seem to have neglected their thoughts in the very recent past. So what I want to say is the following. Much of our uh, developmental policies and the manner in which we think of development has been very much uh, to generate growth at all cost. to have growth at all cost, so that the growth becomes the end all of our developmental process. Rather than that, whether we could not think in terms of focusing on an alternative process of development, which has in fact been thought of and discussed by some of our major political figures who thought about the issue of economic development in a very serious way. Now, while considering this, I want to look at the thoughts of 3 or 4 major Indian figures. I'm not saying that we should necessarily be going back to the way they have conceptualized the issue of economic development, but I feel that it is important to think of their contributions at the center, because they understood the Indian developmental process in a very substantial way. So I'm going to be looking at 3 or 4 major ways of looking at the development process. First, from the point of view of Mahatma Gandhi. Second, from the point of view of Jawaharlal Nehru. Third, from the point of view of Jayaprakash Narayan. Fourth, from the point of view of Ram Manohar Lohia. These are the 4 major figures. Now, there are very many other figures we can think of, but I thought, let me simply look at what they have to say. Now, what I'm trying to say is that it is not that we need to follow each and every sort of specific detail of the suggestions emerging from the thinking and writing of these figures, but I feel that we need to nevertheless keep their thoughts very much in our view, because I think they understood the Indian reality and the Indian economy much better than many of our modern thinkers and so policymakers in this country. So to begin at the beginning, think of Mahatma Gandhi, and I'll be brief in the sort of presentation of the thoughts of each of these people, and I'll be closing by a little around 9 o'clock or so, and after that we can have some discussion. Think of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhiji was not an economist in any strict sense. He had never really studied economics. He was a student of law. In the year 1909, Gandhiji wrote his book, very small book, Hind Swaraj, hardly 75 pages. Now, Gandhiji was 40 years of age at that point in time. And the book was written when he was on a ship voyage from London to South Africa. He was still based in South Africa at that particular point in time. By that time, he had already read a book by John Ruskin. And in that particular book, Ruskin, who was an English sort of writer and philosopher, had questioned the thoughts of the classical economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and so forth, because the classical economists in England, in their work, in Adam Smith's work, for example, self-interest was the defining factor in economic sort of activity. All economic agents pursue their self-interest. That was the key idea. That was also the case with Ricardo. That was also the case with John Stuart Mill. Ruskin was questioning that. Unto this last, this was the book that Ruskin wrote, and this is the book that Gandhiji read. Now, Ruskin was asking the question as to whether we should not be thinking in terms of economies which look at sympathy and sort of fellow feeling rather than individual self-interest. And this particular idea of Ruskin was attractive to Gandhiji. So Gandhiji was questioning the classical economists' assumption of pursuing self-interest. And Gandhiji was saying that what Ruskin had said, namely looking at the welfare of the fellow beings, that was to be the defining um, manner in which economic activity should be thought of. Now, if you think in terms of looking at economic activity in this manner, a number of propositions follow. In Gandhiji's formulation, the problem of the Indian economy was simply something that had to be addressed by looking at the demographic structure of the economy. Huge mass of population, very little capital available. So Gandhiji thought that the Indian economy, the first problem for the Indian economy was the problem of employment. And Gandhiji thought that each and every person should be gainfully employed. That was the first and foremost idea that you find in Swaraj. The second idea was that Gandhiji observed that India lives in her villages. So Gandhiji believed that there should be a notion of, developing the Indian villages as self-sufficient entities. This was the second major idea of Gandhiji, and he knew that the development of India was consonant with developing the Indian villages. This was Gandhiji's idea. Now, there were a few other ideas that Gandhiji thought of. One particular idea was the following. Gandhiji looked at the Gandhiji was quite familiar with the Western setting. He was himself a student in London. So he knew that the Western economic thinking was based on the idea of expansion of the good space. That is what classical economics and that is what neoclassical economics is all about, expanding the production possibility frontier. Now, Gandhiji believed that that was the wrong way of looking at economic management. And he dared to suggest that we should think in terms of reducing wants, not expanding the production possibility frontier, but reducing wants. Instead of increasing the good space, Gandhiji was suggesting that we should, human beings should reduce their wants. That would be consistent with maintaining the sort of ecological balance. I mean, today there is a very substantial interest in the ideas of Gandhiji on the issue of, precisely on this issue. Rather than increase the goods and services, you think in terms of reducing human wants so that there are fewer demands on the ecological availability of resources. There were two or three other aspects of Gandhiji's thoughts that are important. One is his focus on the welfare of the worst off member of the economy or society. Now, this is important to understand because when you look at either classical or neoclassical economics, we think in terms of the societal objective or societal maximand to be something like a utilitarian objective of summing up the utilities of all individuals. Now, Gandhiji was of the view that that is not the right way to go. you should be focusing on the welfare of the bottommost sections of the population. He called it the Daridra Narayan, and in fact, he wrote about it extensively. Um, Focusing on the welfare of the worst of member first and foremost. Now, that is to be seen as the welfare maximand in what we today have as the Rawlsian social objective. Instead of the utilitarian objective, you can think in terms of the Rawlsian objective of focusing on the welfare of the worst of member. That was another aspect of Gandhiji's thoughts. And one final aspect that I want to touch on in Gandhiji's thought is this. Gandhiji was of the view that neither uh, uh, he was not ever a person who was attracted to the capitalist mode of economic activity. He did not want that because that leads to inequality, and that leads to greater degree of centralization. Gandhiji was against that. He was also against communism because communism meant a degree of um, sort of violence. The Marxian mode of having a revolution and having a communist world entailed some amount of violence, and Gandhiji was against that. And so Gandhiji's um, uh, uh, object was to think in terms of what he called a trusteeship idea. Human beings are uh, going to have the full power over their individual sphere of activity. And Gandhiji was against a public ownership of means of production. He was against that. And he believed that if there are production activities that lead to some people becoming big capitalists, he believed that those capitalists should behave as trustees, because this capital, uh, this this concentration of economic activity has emerged in a societal context, and the capitalists should behave as trustees of this particular property, and this property and its uh, the benefits of this property should come to the community at large, and the capitalist should behave as the trustee. Now, this particular idea of Gandhiji, this trusteeship idea, was critiqued by very many people, including Pandit Nehru, JP, Gunnar Myrdal, and very many others. But these were some of the ideas. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that Gandhiji's ideas were a critique of the Western mode of economic thinking, and it probably might have constrained the growth possibilities if you are to think in terms of a Gandhian economic model. And by the way, the Gandhian idea was very much taken up by a number of his close followers. One of them was a person by the name J.C. Kumarappa, who coined the phrase Gandhian economics, and the point one is trying to make is that the Gandhian mode of thinking was not addressed towards maximizing the growth potential, whereas it was certainly directed towards uh, minimizing the distress of the lowest earning members of society, and it was addressed to minimizing the demands on the uh, ecological availability of resources. So minimizing the world's resources and making the most of few resources so that human beings lead a meaningful life and a sustainable life as well. Uh, there's a lot of interest in the Gandhian mode of thinking among the modern day environmentalists who believe that this possibly has the best answers for the issue of sustainable economic development. That is one particular alternative mode of thinking in terms of political economy that I thought we should spend a little time on. But that is not the only sort of way of looking at an alternative. Consider the Nehruvian alternative. Now, today we have a situation where the Nehruvian alternative is thought to be um, an alternative with a lot of ills. And in fact, a lot of the critique of the modern dispensation is directed at the Nehruvian mode of planning and so forth. But what I want to say is the following. Nehru was a person who was attracted to the socialist mode of thinking pretty early on in his in his life when he was a student in UK in Cambridge University, and he had come across the writings of the Fabian socialists, and he was attracted to that idea. And that idea was based on the idea of the state playing a major role in the activity of human beings to provide, in particular, education and health. They are to be in the state sector. And uh, the state to have a broad sort of control over the resources, in the sense that Nehru believed in 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 a strong role of the public sector. In fact, in the 1920s, he had been invited by the newly sort of uh, sort of independent Soviet Republic, which was sort of the Tsarist Russia was gone. It was the Soviet Republic. Nehru had been invited on their 10th anniversary, 1927. He went to Soviet Union, and he had been much attracted by the Soviet process of growth. And he was sure that once India becomes independent, this was the way to bring about sort of addressing the key problems that were facing the Indian economy. Um, uh, 1950, the Planning Commission was set up, and Nehru, as the Prime Minister, was the chair of the Planning Commission. And even though the planning regime had a number of difficulties, in particular, the growth rate under the planning regime was restricted to something like 3.5 to 4 percentage points. No doubt about that. But that was also the period in which the Nehruvian mode of development gave maximum emphasis to education and health under the sort of available resources, the institutions of higher learning, the university system, the IITs, the IIMs, all of these were developed at that time. And if today India is a country with reasonably good sort of availability of scientists, engineers, doctors, and so forth, at least some of that we have to thank the Nehruvian vision in the 1950s and 60s for this. So it was a different kind of approach that Nehru had from that of Gandhi. They, in fact, were sort of constantly arguing about their economic ideas through the late 20s, 30s, and early 40s. There are extensive discussions between Nehru and Gandhi on this. They stuck to their position. Gandhi had his own position, Nehru had his position. They stuck to their position. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Nehruvian vision was one which had a number of important elements that have stood the Indian economy in good stead. And in particular, Nehru's emphasis on the scientific sort of approach to looking at all behavior. He was a rationalist. He believed in the propagation of science and technology and the propagation of education and health, and all of that has stood in good stead. Very quickly, I'll say a few things about JP and Lohia. JP, very briefly, very briefly. Jayaprakash Narayan was uh, junior to, of course, Gandhiji and Nehru and so on, but both of these individuals very much liked JP's ideas. JP was a Marxist. At a very early stage, he went to the US. He worked in farms and factories and so forth, earned some money to gain some basic education, returned back to the country. He was a Marxist. And to cut a long story short, he essentially believed that the Indian economy, the solution to the problems of the Indian economy uh, lay in a kind of revolutionary understanding of the production activity in the farms as well as in the factories. This was JP's essential idea. And uh, at a certain point in time, JP was even given to uh, uh, sort of engaging in, if he thought that if violence had to be resorted to in order to get a more humane society, we should go in for violence. But this was only for a very brief period. Later on, he was very much under the influence of Gandhiji also. He gave up this idea of the um, role of violence in revolution, and he believed that revolution should be completely peaceful. By the 1950s, JP had already changed his position from being a violent revolutionary to a person under Gandhiji's influence to be a non-violent revolutionary person. And his idea was to have something like a total revolution where we alter all our thinking processes so that feudalism is given up and all of us become co-owners of all means of production, and farming and factory activities are co-owned by all individuals. Lastly, I come to, you see, I'm looking at all these alternative modes of thought with the idea that in the Indian setting, we have had a number of people. Let me complete this process. I lastly look at Ram Manohar Lohia. Lohia was the last of the four people I'm looking at. And as I said, these are not the only individuals who define the Indian alternative mode of thinking. There are very many others. There is Ambedkar and so forth. Lack of time does not allow me to, look at all the other points of view. I'll just briefly look at Lohia's sort of way of thinking. Lohia too was among all of these four people, Lohia was the only economist. Gandhiji and Nehru were the lawyers. Um, uh, Jayaprakash Narayan was a student of sociology, though he was well read in economics also. He was well read in Marx. Lohia was the one who was the economist of the entire four. And at a young age, at the age of 20 or so, he went to Germany to do his PhD. He became a student of Werner Sombart, a very well-known German economist. He was a um, German economist, one of the last of the German historical school, Werner Sombart. And Sombart was the person who coined the phrase creative destruction. The word creative destruction, the phrase creative destruction was used by Schumpeter to define capitalism. So, but the original formulator of this phrase was Lohia's advisor, Werner Sombart. Now, Lohia worked on the salt tax. This was his PhD dissertation. He worked on the salt tax. He returned to India, and in the mid 1930s, Lohia and JP were important members of the Congress Socialist Party. Congress Socialist Party, and Lohia's ideas were something as follows. Lohia was also very much a Gandhian. He came under the influence of Gandhiji, and he uh, understood that India was best understood by Gandhiji. The problems of India were best understood by Gandhiji. The reason I'm saying all this is because at some level, what I'm trying to suggest is that much of classical and neoclassical economics that we study is um, from the sort of conceptualizations of the economic problems that exist in England, Europe, and North America. And if we think in terms of looking at the economic solution of the problems simply by using the classical and neoclassical economics developed in Europe, North America, and England, that may not be quite appropriate. And the reason I'm saying this is because these four names, just by an example, these four names were uh, these are the names of people who have tried to understand the Indian reality. Gandhiji, certainly, very much so. Sometimes people question whether Jawaharlal Nehru understood the Indian reality. Let me tell you that it is often very wrongly believed that Nehru was purely an aristocrat who did not understand the Indian reality. Actually, that is not really the case. It is certainly true that Nehru was born in a aristocratic setting. Motilal Nehru was a very rich lawyer and all of that. He went to UK for his school education as well as college education. All of that is true. But after his return to India, Motilal Nehru wanted Jawaharlal Nehru to be simply a good lawyer and become very rich practicing in the Allahabad court, but that was not the case. Almost immediately, Jawaharlal lost interest in doing the sort of legal cases and earning money and being a rich lawyer. His interest lay in understanding social reality and political reality. And in the beginning 1920s, this was something that this was the period where Nehru got active in the activities of the UP Kisans in the eastern part of Uttar Pradesh, in the Allahabad, Pratapgarh, and all these districts. For a number of years, Nehru cut his political teeth working among the Kisans of Uttar Pradesh. For long stints, he stayed in stayed in the villages of Uttar Pradesh, and he lived along with the Kisans, and he learned about their lives. So what I want to say is that this is a person I know in the beginning 20s. This is the manner in which Jawaharlal Nehru uh, started his political activity, and then of course he was very much drawn into the national sort of movement. Gandhiji was the supreme leader. So the point I'm trying to make is that these four individuals, and there are very many others we could have considered, these individuals understood the nature of the Indian reality, all of them. And coming lastly to Lohia, Lohia was very much a person who believed that the Western mode of either capitalism or the Soviet kind of communism was not appropriate for India. Again, very much like the Gandhian mode of thinking. And Lohia in particular was very much in favor of the small sector. He wanted appropriate level of capital use uh, in the countryside, small towns, and so forth, so that all human beings are engaged. Very much like the Gandhian sort of mode of engaging everyone. So jobs for all is something that was very much a central part of Lohia's thinking as well. So in fact, he coined the phrase. He was against the Western kind of capitalism and the Western kind of communism or even socialism. And for him, he coined the phrase the principle of equal irrelevance. For Lohia, the ideas of capitalism and socialism that we learn in the textbooks are irrelevant in the Indian setting. The Indian setting has to be unique in itself because the Indian conditions are unique. This was Lohia's idea. He had absolutely sort of totally independent and revolutionary kind of ideas. Of course, he was completely a pacifist. He was all of these individuals, including JP, who briefly was willing to be um, to adopt violent modes, and he later gave that up also. So all of these individuals were for a notion of a social progress, which was necessarily a pacifist kind of manner of social progress. All of these were individuals were uh, familiar with the Marxian mode of thinking, all of these individuals, and all of these individuals were a social mode of thinking. Now, I will conclude by simply saying that if you look at the current dispensation, there is no doubt that when we look at the kind of development process that we are having, I've already indicated that the economic inequality is getting sharpened. The corporatization is getting in a stronger and stronger, no question about it. The stock markets are booming. That is definitely a feature of today's India. But side by side with that, the farmers' sort of distress continues. The demands of the farmers are being disregarded. I think that is the least that one can say. And and the the rights of factory workers also are not what they were even, let's say, 10 years back, because progressively what we see is that there is a notion that we should have a situation where workers should be hired and fired at ease. So what does this mean? We have a situation here where about 90% of the Indian population is in the informal sector, um, no regular jobs, general level of earnings very low, and this affects the vast majority of the population, certainly 90% of the population. And we've had an experience in the very recent months of migrant laborers without any job security returning back to their villages and remaining there without any kind of job support. And now, if you look at the latest budget, even support for MG Narega, that has gone down in the coming budget, even though, that is possibly one of the few major government interventions that enables people to have jobs for themselves. Even that is the allocation for that, if I remember right, revised estimate 2021 was about 1.11 lakh crores. And right now, in the coming year, 21-22, the budgeted amount for MG Narega is barely 73,000 crores, well below the amount that was spent as revised estimate. So all in all, what I'm trying to say is that the actual economic policy seems to be moving in a corporatized kind of direction, whereas there is ample thinking within India among, you do not have to be a pure Gandhian or a pure Nehruvian. That is not my point. The point I'm trying to make is that if you look at the thinking of these individuals and some more, there is an unmistakable notion that we should be thinking in terms of the welfare of the vast majority of the population. And that particular approach to looking at economic thinking and economic philosophy is not to be seen in the current dispensation. So I think I've taken much more time than I should have, but let me conclude here. There's still some time for some observations and thoughts.